Health and Equity for the consortium, who will be moderating the session for us. I'll turn it over to you, Linda.
Thanks so much. We see climate change and health inequities as the greatest health challenges before us. And we know that our current transportation system is a big contributor to both. That's why we've been advocating for transforming our transportation system to prioritize reductions in vehicle miles traveled and concomitant increases in the use of transit and active transportation, electrifying our vehicles, starting with school buses and trucks, and focusing on fixing our current infrastructure rather than building new highways. We couldn't have two more knowledgeable and committed people for our panel today, which will drill down a bit more into detail on the transportation components of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and what health professionals can do to enhance its implementation to promote our climate, health, and equity goals. Beth Osborne is the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit that advocates for a sustainable, healthy, and equitable transportation system. She previously served as Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Transportation as an advisor to Senator Tom Carper on transportation, trade, and labor policy. Andrew Wishnia is currently the Deputy for Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. He previously worked for the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and before that for many years in various capacities at the Federal Highway Administration from 2010 to 2017. So both Beth and Andrew have just a wealth of experience and expertise on our transportation system and on climate and transportation policy. You can find more about their illustrious backgrounds in the program guide, and I will turn it over to Andrew and get started.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. I think it's extraordinary that all three of us have background with Chairman Carper, but it speaks to both his longevity and his hiring of transportation professionals. So it's great to hear about your background, and I've always admired Beth's work, and am so grateful and appreciative for sharing this virtual stage with her. And thanks to all of you. What an honor it is to be here. The Biden-Harris administration knows that climate change is a defining challenge of our time. And at the beginning of his term, the president set an ambitious science-driven target to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 and reach net zero economy-wide emissions by 2050. And the last time I was here, I spoke a bit about sort of our vision. And that's because the transportation sector is responsible for more climate pollution than any other sector of the American economy, which means that the transportation system can and must be a huge part of building a cleaner future. And Secretary Buttigieg has made climate change a top priority for our department in our domestic policies and also our international cooperation. So the department has a suite of existing authorities to seize this opportunity, but I did want to speak particularly about the bipartisan infrastructure law, which gives us even more tools to build better infrastructure that mitigates greenhouse gas pollution and is more resilient to climate impacts as well. And we're laser focused on implementing it well, and on doing what we can to provide technical assistance, to our friends in Congress to move the Build Back Better Act as well. But our race to stop the climate crisis is not just a question of what will be lost if we fail. It's about what can be gained if we succeed, right? Good paying jobs, new resilient infrastructure, more livable cities, cleaner air, healthier communities, and so much more. So here's how we are laying out how we can get there together. In November, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law that provides really not just a once in a generation opportunity, depending on how we implement it, a once in a lifetime opportunity to meet this consequential moment and build a better future. This law can help create millions of jobs and fix and modernize our transportation system. And it can help us prepare for and address climate change. Much of the money in the BIL flows directly through states, but there are also new opportunities for funds to support localities as well. So we're going to need strong partnership and coordination through, local, state, and tribes to ensure our shared values are realized. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But with the investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we can give people the option to leave their cars at home. So the bipartisan infrastructure law is the largest investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak. It's the largest federal investment in public transit in American history, including over $5 billion for electric buses and transit. And a number of investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law will support active transportation. The bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, provides $7.2 billion for the Transportation Alternatives Program, which supports pedestrian and bike infrastructure. I'm guessing a lot of folks on this call are already familiar with that program, recreational trails, safe routes to school, and more. And the bipartisan infrastructure law also includes a $6 billion first of its kind Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which will provide funding directly to local and tribal governments to make our streets safer, especially for those walking, biking, and rolling. This will also support the implementation of the department's National Roadway Safety Strategy. My good friend and colleague, Robin Hutchinson, really shepherded that strategy across the finish line, which we just recently released. The bipartisan infrastructure law can also help us win the EV market. The law allocates up to $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure that can help automakers establish a strong domestic supply chain and build a network of 500,000 EV chargers all over the country, but especially in rural areas where people stand to save the most money on gas, in addition to urban cores, underserved and overburdened communities. $5 billion of this is formula funding of the up to $7.5 billion, which will go to states. So your leadership on this will be paramount. States can also look forward to new formula funding through the carbon reduction program. $6.4 billion will go to states, but also localities through a 65% suballocation to support projects that reduce transportation-related emissions. And then states and localities will also benefit from the new Protect program, both the formula side and the discretionary side, to focus on the resilience of our transportation system through funding for evacuation routes, coastal resilience, making infrastructure more resilient, our efforts to move infrastructure to nearby locations, not continuously impacted by extreme weather and natural disasters. And the infrastructure law will also support port and maritime decarbonization, which we know are hard to address areas as well. But now there's explicit eligibility and additional funding to support electrification, as well as support for other alternative fueling infrastructure and researching new technologies. I did want to mention that the bipartisan infrastructure law, represents an opportunity to rebuild our infrastructure, as I just mentioned, but not just to build it back the way it was, but to build it back, more equitably, more sustainably. And as we implement it, we need help from all of our partners, especially leaders on this call today, to make the most of this opportunity. And so to that end, you may have heard a little something about the Federal Highway Administration recently releasing a guidance memo as a reinforcement that the U.S. Department of Transportation has high expectations of state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations in carrying out the president's vision. This memo encourages funding recipients to take a fix-it-first approach, prioritizing repair, rehabilitation, and modernization of existing roads and bridges over expanding capacity. This guidance applies both to existing programs and new programs, and we need your help to continue to make sure that states' use of funding supports our broader goals for equity, safety, and climate. And we're going to be working with our division administrators in implementing what's called the Building for a Better America Act memo, or BBAM. In addition to bipartisan infrastructure law implementation, the Department of Transportation is also seeking to reduce greenhouse gas pollution through existing resources and authorities. Some of those initiatives are department-wide. For example, we're ensuring that climate is a consideration when awarding funding under discretionary grant programs, and transportation modal administrations are also taking actions specific to their purviews. The Federal Highway Administration issued new guidance to help states use their existing transportation rights-of-way to host transmission lines, build renewable energy projects. We just heard about renewable community solar in the last segment of this discussion, and supporting EV charging infrastructure as well. The Federal Aviation Administration released an updated aviation climate action plan, laying out key actions across government to help address the climate impacts of aviation. Under the Maritime Administration, Secretary Buttigieg recently announced a new set of port infrastructure development grants, including port projects that support offshore wind development. And the Federal Transit Administration is leading a Sustainable Transit for a Healthy Planet challenge, which, as some of you may know, encourages transit agencies to develop climate action strategies with measurable goals to achieve greenhouse gas emission targets. Even as we work to reduce climate emissions, we also need to make sure our systems are more resilient against the climate change we're experiencing now. The need is everywhere, as you guys are well aware. You know, we see it in the sections of California's Highway 1 that fell into the ocean, and the Gulf Coast flooding that halted rail service after Hurricane Harvey. We see it in the floods in Michigan, the wildfires in California, the deadly snowstorm in Texas, and even the I-5 buckling in the Pacific Northwest. As of October of last year, we did some quick research on this. Climate disasters had already cost the US more than $100 billion in 2021 alone. But the good news is we have strategies available to make our infrastructure more resilient, and we're working to incentivize and implement these strategies right now. The Federal Aviation Administration is developing a national airport strategy to provide a top-down framework for investments in resilient airport infrastructure. The Federal Highway Administration has partnered now with more than 50 pilot project teams across the country to conduct climate change vulnerability assessments and analyze options for improving resilience. The Federal Transit Administration has developed a tool to enable transit agencies to conduct risk-weighted cost-benefit analysis for proposed resilience projects. And as I mentioned earlier, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Laws Protect program will support states in investing in resilient infrastructure. Achieving our climate goals, through BIL implementation and through existing programs is going to require all of us. And the partnership we have with major national medical societies that are on the call today could not be more central for folks to understand this health emergency. In other words, we need all of you. So look forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for all of your work thus far. And we look forward to continuing this important work together. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's really exciting to hear somebody in your position in the Department of Transportation talking about the health and equity and climate benefits that are possible as we invest more in transportation. We're getting a lot of great questions in the chat, but I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and then we'll save time for questions at the end. So Beth.
Thanks so much. So I'm Beth Osborne. I am the Director of Transportation for America, a national nonprofit dedicated to a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services, no matter their financial means or physical ability. We do our work through policy analysis, development and advocacy, through research and analysis of how the existing system is working, and through direct technical assistance with those who are trying to achieve our mission. Just a quick, I know you've spoken about this a lot, but if we just jump to the first slide, I'm sure you've seen this during the last 2 days, the big role that transportation plays in greenhouse gas emissions. And just to point out that that is still one area that is increasing. It's never really started to decrease. We're hoping to see some decrease because we're going to tackle that purple section, which is cars by electrification. But if we jump to the next slide, one of the big points I want to make here is that we can undermine the speed of the if we could jump to the next slide, the point I want to make is that we can severely undermine the speed of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by continuing the same trend we've had for 70 years, really 100 years, where we make people drive more to accomplish the same things that they were doing before. The average person has increased the number of miles they have to drive by 5 miles a day since the time I graduated from college and back in the 90s. And that is so unsustainable in so many ways. If we go on to the next slide, I want to point out that the climate emissions go well beyond the tailpipe. The EVs are absolutely essential. We cannot decarbonize transportation without EVs. They're just not sufficient. The fact of the matter is climate emissions go beyond the tailpipe. There is the construction and the movement of vehicles. There is the actual construction of the system itself. And climate impacts go beyond emissions. We've got the continued challenge that will come from runoff, like flooding. There's the heat island effect. There's the loss of greenery as we continue to develop further and further out. That greenery is what absorbs a lot of the carbon. There's the environmental impacts that go beyond the climate impacts to habitat and water quality. There's the health impacts that go beyond the climate impacts, like brakes and tires, and the pavement itself will emit health impacting pollutants. In fact, as the days get warmer, the pavement itself will emit more, and that pavement makes people sick, makes them more likely to get upper respiratory infections like COVID. Health impacts also include your very life. The safety impacts of our transportation system are going in the wrong direction, particularly for people outside of a car. They've been going in the wrong direction for more than a decade. They have absolutely skyrocketed over the last 2 years, and EVs are heavier. So if we don't fix the underlying problems with the existing system, we are going to exacerbate that. And the economic impacts are strong too, because where we devolve our transportation system to only move vehicles quickly, which is more and more of the system, we actually undermine local economic development. It's the slower streets and frankly, the more trafficked and congested streets that perform the best economically, that attract the most business and attract the most talent. And finally, because this underlines literally everything I've talked about, the equity impacts beyond all of these issues. The impact to communities of having too much pavement, too fast roadways, dividing them, digging under them, which continues to this day. It's not just a relic of the past. The ability to reach your needs if you don't have a car are impacted by building highways through people's communities. And I mean highways at surface level. I'm not talking about interstates. I'm talking about those arterial roadways that are built for 50 miles per hour that you see all across the country. And finally, the cost to a household of needing a car to be able to accomplish quite literally everything you need to do. The bottom line is we can make a big, though not total, impact on greenhouse gases from the transportation system while leaving all of the other negatives in place. I certainly hope we aren't that foolish. We can't fix problems of a car-only system with a car-only solution. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do beyond EVs. If we go to the next slide, I just want to point out a handful of things. You'll see here that the parts of the transportation or the infrastructure bill I work on are in the pie on the right. Transit and highways increased at the same amount, but that rail title is a big, big, big boost. That rail used to be this little tiny sliver of a program, and now it's really as big as the transit program. The thing is, for us to really deploy particularly inner city rail, we are going to need a lot more than money. We're going to need the Surface Transportation Board and FRA to be very aggressive with the Class 1 railroads who are often blocking, using legal authority to block the expansion of rail. And we're going to need to increase our capacity at the federal level to manage all these programs as well as at the state level. On the next slide, I want to really point out that, just want to make sure we get to that next slide. Thank you. I really want to point out that the real issue is the formula dollars. We have unprecedented amount of competitive grants. They equal about 5.5% of the program. And while that's important, that is nothing like, the other 94.5% of the program. If we jump to the next slide, within the formula program, you'll notice that a lot of the great programs that people are excited about make up 1/4 of the pie. The Surface Transportation Block Grant and the National Highway Performance Program are the biggest blocks, and they are incredibly flexible. So that's where we're going to really move the needle on climate, health, equity, every other issue. That's the part that is going to matter the most. I want to point out here that this is in the power of the states. The states have the money and the means, technically and tool wise, to address climate and health and equity and everything else, but they have the authority and the discretion not to under the law. And so we have to remember that we are going to need to get 52, including DC and Puerto Rico, state DOTs to do the right thing independently. So going ahead, just in terms of some recommendations of how we might do that. On the next slide. Oh, let me just mention that this is my fun little cartoon that I developed for safety, but it's true for climate as well. If we just look at the program with our name on it, like the carbon reduction program, or in safety, the highway safety improvement program, we're going to spend the overwhelming majority of the money digging us deeper into a hole while barely getting anything in there to dig our way out of it. So like I said, if we care about climate or safety or anything, every dollar has to go to these issues, not just a tiny portion of the pie. So going on to the next slide, some things that we can do. There's opportunities for USDOT in their implementation to more aggressively track in a public way that people can follow state performance in these priority areas, to use their competitive grants to reward success. And when I say support improvement in challenge areas, I mean very stringently. Maybe we shouldn't even allow folks to come in or make clear we're unwilling to fund a state that comes in with a highway expansion project if they're having a lot of trouble on the climate side, or a state that is setting targets to have very modest improvement in safety. Maybe we only want to fund their safety projects as a way to really encourage them to focus on those areas that they're just struggling with. We need to do a lot to improve modeling and measure induced demand. Right now, we are counting projects as great benefits to climate and the transportation system that just make everything worse. We can update all the design guidelines that encourage us to build highways through communities as opposed to slow moving roadways, which is the only safe and effective way to move people through communities. Where there's development, vehicles should move slowly. Where you want vehicles to move quickly, you cannot have development by it. It is that binary and that simple. And when we do that, we'll see great climate impacts as well. And we can help states and MPOs by helping them measure the right thing, which is our mission, to measure whether or not people are actually reaching jobs and services. Right now, we assume if the cars are moving fast, that is happening, but that turns out to not be true. On the next slide, what states can do is they can measure greenhouse gas emissions. No state's really doing this very effectively, but they don't have to be told to do it. They can just do it. They can address the problems of now and not the unknowable needs of 20 years away, which is what they do, and it's why they overbuild. They can focus on repairing existing structure before building new. They can actually just investigate where their vehicle miles traveled is coming from and try to stem the bleeding. They can also improve their modeling and measure induced demand, and they can build equity, climate, and safety into all projects, not just the programs whose words are in that name. And to just finish up, I will say in terms of us as advocates, what we can do is we can show up, because frankly, the supporters rarely show up in time of change. The opponents always do. And if we really care, we have to show up and give cover to those who are trying to do the right thing, because change is going to be hard no matter what. And that's where I end.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. You've given us a lot of food for thought. And we're starting to get some interesting questions in the chat. If we can just have the final slide. There should be one more slide in the slide deck. No?
No, that's it.
I think Linda, you add an additional slide. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Nope. Okay. We will skip that. I wanted to just point people to a study that was just published in the American Journal of Public Health that looked at the health benefits of electrification of automobiles and the health benefits of a significant shift to active transportation. And it's just a reminder that we really have to do both. The air pollution emissions reductions from electrification of autos are obviously very important from a health perspective, but as Beth pointed out, don't deal with the rising fraction of particulate matter emissions from transportation that are due to road and brake tire wear. And active transportation gives all of the benefits of increased physical activity, the lack of which really is a major contributor to our epidemic of diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. So we have to keep our eyes on both sides of the puzzle, which I think Beth really pointed out. I'm wondering if, I think we have some questions about, like, there's so much happening in the transportation arena, and so much of it goes through state, regional, and local agencies. If either of you can comment on sort of what are the timelines for these really important pots of money, and is there a relatively easy way for people like us in the health professions to track where important opportunities are for speaking up for transportation investments that promote our climate and health goals?
I'm happy to start the conversation. Thank you so much for that question. I should mention that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so in addition to sort of the explicit authority that was provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're looking to supplement that authority in every way possible with the actions that are required by the president, through his executive orders. One of those requirements is to take a look at the greenhouse gas emission performance measure that was finalized during the Obama administration, withdrew during the Trump administration. We're reconsidering that. And to a certain extent, it is that sort of performance management construct that Beth spoke a little to on a more multimodal basis that will help underpin the sort of data that is necessary to provide not only states, but localities, municipalities throughout the country, the tools that are necessary to manage emissions. The good news, as Beth mentioned, is a requirement is not needed. States and localities can go ahead and undertake those efforts today. But in terms of resources, the Department of Transportation continuously posts resources about updates regarding all of the program guidance that they issue. All of our modal administrations post updates as well. We just published a complete streets report within the past week, in addition to having sort of a ports week last week, where we had the American Marine Highway Program grants come out, in addition to the port infrastructure development grants come out. Look, we have a $1.2 trillion bill, and so we're going to have activity every week. Some of that we're obviously going to post up on our website, but my hope and my suspicion is that folks like Beth and stakeholders across the country are going to be lifting up guidance and ways to inform public processes, in addition to the NOFOs and the opportunities that we release through DOT. But Beth, I don't know if you want to speak a little.
Totally. And thank you for that plug. We most certainly will be drawing people's attention to those opportunities, especially at the federal level, and even sometimes when we see them at the state level. So you can definitely get on our mailing list or follow our blog. We try not only to share information, but to break it down in a way that is useful. We have a new portal just for IIJA implementation. This is the point where I have to let people know that implementing any reauthorization bill is a huge, huge multi-year task. And this is one of the most aggressive and wide-ranging bill that I've seen in my career. So the work that they have to do at DOT to implement this thing is vast. Also, we keep discovering things in the language because there are thousands of pages. And so, we're going to try and keep everybody up to date as much as possible. So yes, follow USDOT's site. They're doing a good job of, keeping folks in the loop. You can get alerts from the Federal Register when USDOT takes an action. I'm on their mailing list, and most days it's a lot of aviation stuff that isn't in my wheelhouse. But every now and then you'll see all these great actions come up. The state, where frankly the majority of the effort needs to be, because we have given them a lot of money without much constraint. And so they, like I said, have the authority to not do any of these things we said we care about, or very little. I would say the procedure doesn't matter because it's not built to include people very well, or it was built to allow people to be included. But after years of utilizing it, states have found ways to get around that. Focus very much on your governor and your legislature, which somehow never get blamed for what their DOTs do, even though they're 100% responsible for it, and tell them what you expect and be very specific. I would also say that there are a lot of tools out there that you can use now that can be quite helpful in making a case. I find that unfortunately, the best thing to do is often to point out where folks are messing up. So I'm sharing the shift calculator that we created with the Rocky Mountain Institute and NRDC and the research organization at the University of Wisconsin, in order to allow you to measure induced demand. If your state's not doing it, hand it right over to the press with all the CO2 impacts and get some good coverage there. And that tends to get your governor's attention, especially if you're in a state with a governor who claims that climate's a big issue, but doesn't really act that way. We're working on an update to Dangerous by Design, which is the report that shows the damage done by a car-only system to pedestrians in particular, and how inequitable the burden is placed on Black and Native Americans more than any other group. And you can show that information to your state and call for better performance there. And finally, in terms of measuring access to jobs and essential services, you hold the power to do that in the palm of your hand through your smartphone. Our DOTs haven't figured out how to do what we do on our smartphones in their transportation program, using GIS and really looking at how to get people where they need to go. We're still using proxies developed in the 1950s. We can teach them how to use this now relatively old technology. GIS is over 20 years old, and smartphones are a good 12 to 13 years old. So let's give them a little push and encourage them to use a technology that is, less than 70 years old.
Thank you. So both of you at one point or another mentioned that a large proportion of the dollars in the infrastructure bill are formula dollars, and that states and local governments will have discretion. I'm curious about what DOT can do in terms of either enforcement or criteria that it establishes, or guidance to enhance the proportion of dollars that go into investments and projects that further our goals rather than go into building highways that move us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Linda. It's a great one. And so, I know that there's an echo chamber within DC. And for those that are unfamiliar with that echo chamber, there was a memo that I mentioned at the outset that was published just a couple of months ago by our Deputy Administrator, Stephanie Pollock, called the Building for a Better America memo. And that memo actually went internally to our division administrators, but it was forwarded to an external audience. And that memo was really intended to provide our division administrators directionality with respect to the formula funding, particularly for our legacy apportionments that were uploaded into our financial management systems almost immediately after the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It takes us some time, to Beth's point, to get all of the, hundreds of billions of dollars out the door and to get guidance produced, regulations written. And so we wanted to provide this memorandum to provide some direction to our division administrators and working with our state departments of transportation on how we're envisioning the overlay of the administration's priorities relative to bipartisan infrastructure law implementation. And so what that memo said in part was, to the greatest extent possible, folks should be thinking about prudent investments with taxpayer resources, right? And by the way, this is not a democratic or a progressive norm. This is just common sense thinking to look at ways to fix it first and to repair assets to a state of good repair before looking to other uses and eligibilities of federal funds. So things like resilience, things like state of good repair, things like reducing emissions, those things were lifted up and prioritized. And it so happens that if you build out in your existing operational right-of-way for purposes of complying and conforming to the National Environmental Policy Act, by and large, for transit projects, for bike projects, for EV charging infrastructure, active transportation, more broadly, it's not true in every case, but by and large, there are a number of categorical exclusions that you can also take advantage of to accelerate those projects to be delivered as efficaciously as possible. So that memo, Linda, was released a couple of months ago, and that's providing, I think, a national conversation, not so much in terms of whether and to what extent the teeth are to actually, say yes or no to a project, but in terms of providing a focus and discussion as to how states should be prioritizing. And so this is a long-winded way of saying, I think, folks can use that memo as leverage to have conversations, on the ground about whether they're prioritizing the kinds of projects that make, good pocketbook sense. And by the way, make good sense for prioritizing safety, for prioritizing equity, and yes, for prioritizing climate as well.
2 follow-up questions to
Can I just
that.
add real quick on that?
Sure,
So
go ahead.
I think that this memo, I have to state, this is a totally and utterly unenforceable memo. This is a statement of priorities. It is a statement of good priorities. Every administration has done this, but it doesn't force anything. It doesn't make anything different. It doesn't make anything happen, which is both, well, I'll say it on both sides. One is those who are responding aggressively to it with such negativity are either completely and utterly uninformed about how the program works, which includes a vast number of senators, including one of the leads on it from the Republican side. That's terrifying. Or, and it might be an people who sold a bill on very specific outcomes, like supporting local economies, repairing our crumbling infrastructure. How many people heard that phrase, repairing our crumbling infrastructure, over and over and over again? And then the administration puts out a memo that says, we want you to repair your crumbling infrastructure. And they said, how dare you? So that probably means that they didn't mean any of the stuff they claimed they would do for us. So I would argue next time they're seeking more money, we should maybe not give it to them unless it comes with strings that forces them to do the things that they pretend they want to do when they're asking for their money, but then flip out when the money actually comes through. On the administration side, I hope they have learned, I fear that they have learned that if they say anything bold, that they'll get their head cut off. But I hope they have learned that they should make no little plans. They will get all the negativity with an unenforceable memo as they will get with a real action. They just don't get any of the results.
Thanks, Beth. I think you answered, I think you answered one of the questions from in the chat about whether or not the memo is enforceable. I guess another question related to that for Andrew is, has DOT considered integrating or developing metrics, standard metrics that you could require states or regional governments to submit as a part of their applications or as a part of their reporting that pertain to health impacts, equity impacts, and climate impacts?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, there is one of the two flagship executive orders that the president released within the first couple of weeks of the administration. One, if folks just want to track it, is Executive Order 13990. Basically had a whole list of rulemakings for us to reconsider that were either withdrawn or stood up in the last administration. One of those rulemakings was the greenhouse gas emissions performance measure, which was finalized in January of 2017. The previous administration then withdrew that rulemaking. We are now reconsidering that rulemaking. So, to the point of measuring, managing what you measure, greenhouse gas emissions is something that some states are currently measuring, but we are really trying to, put the performance management framework behind a measure. So states have to set targets to measure performance with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and be held accountable in a transparent way about whether they're reducing those emissions. One final point, not to belabor Beth's great point about the memorandum, and I just with a couple of my colleagues accompanying the secretary to a hearing on this topic last week. I think it is absolutely a fair point to note that there is no legal requirement within the memo. As I mentioned, that memo was intended as an internal memo only, but I don't think that it is for naught. I think it's incredibly important for the federal government to lead by example and to provide directionality to division administrators. And it's provoked a national conversation too about what's missing from those sorts of policies, because things haven't been enacted by Congress, but it at least starts a conversation that our division administrators can have with state departments of transportation about common sense policies, again, like state of good repair, resilience, climate, safety, equity, that for so long has been lacking.
I think we have time for one or possibly two more questions. Several people have asked about how we can really make our roads safer. I think we all know that people won't walk and bike if it isn't safe. We also know that there's very significant disparities in pedestrian bicycle fatalities in low-income communities and communities of color. So can you speak more, Beth, from your perspective about what DOT and state transportation agencies can do to make our roads safer? And Andrew, what DOT plans to do? For example, will you be updating the guidance for road design for traffic engineers so that it's oriented more around safety rather than on vehicle speed?
So there's a lot that I can say. I really do encourage folks to check out Dangerous by Design, which I put in the chat. It gets into some detail, has some nice sketches that talks about what it is about the way we design our roadways that make them fundamentally unsafe. We design them with one purpose in mind, which is to move vehicles quickly. If you look at the very first and really only performance measure used for designing, it's called level of service, which looks at the speed of vehicle movement. We never look at where crashes might occur and try to avoid them. The only thing we do is say, well, if we're going to accommodate high-speed vehicles, which is the goal, we know that people make mistakes at high speeds. So we need to get rid of the buildings and have clear zones. And we put our sidewalks in the clear zones that are supposed to accommodate where vehicle or drivers might lose control and drive like crazy through. This is not a system designed for safety. We love to say safety is our top priority. Safety is not really a priority. It just is not. There's really nothing in our process that leads to safe outcomes, which is why we've gotten some pretty awful results for years. I will say that people do walk and bike where it is unsafe, because many Americans don't have the option that many of us do. We might turn up our nose at unsafe conditions, but those are only the choices of people with choices. And that's something to remember, especially in poorer neighborhoods. That's where our highest speed roads tend to be. They're often built because the people trying to get through them don't want to have to stop there or slow down there. We don't want things like mid-block crossings, because that would slow us down, even if it's by 5 to 10 seconds. And so we expect people to walk a third or a half a mile across down the way, cross the street, and walk back just across the street. And that is true in almost every community in the United States of America. And that is because you have to justify an extra crossing, not justify not having a crossing, because the goal is to move cars quickly. I'll say two more things. One is that there is an excellent complete streets guidebook that FHWA put out with really all of the right recommendations for action. Once they have taken action on all of those points, I think we will be in a much better position as a nation. Until they do, we will continue to jeopardize human life. They have identified all of the right actions, and we need to help them take them quickly. I think quickly is super important, not just because people are dying today, but also because you need time to socialize change before it can be undone. You need years of socializing the change. Otherwise, what happened with the CO2 rule in the Obama administration will be done with all of these good efforts, where it's undone as soon as this administration walks out the door. And the second thing I will say is the design guide that was someone referenced, known as the Green Book, was just re-upped by FHWA with really not only no changes or no real qualifications, except to say, you can choose to do something else, which is not what an engineer wants to hear. An engineer does not want to be told that they can make stuff up and suffer the consequences if things go poorly legally and professionally. They want guidance, and they're not getting that guidance. They're being told that you are free from legal responsibility if you follow the highway designs of the Green Book, and you could be incredibly legally liable if you don't. We need to change that.
So Andrew, I'm going to give you about 15 seconds if you want to add on to that, because our time is up and we went a little bit longer than we were supposed to because the next speakers weren't quite ready, but they're ready now. So I'll let you wrap up, and I want to just thank both of you so much.
Well, I just admire so much of Beth's and T4's work, including on this issue. So again, it was such an honor to be on this panel with her. And Linda, thank you so much for convening this. As I mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law includes a $6 billion first of its kind Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which will provide funding directly to local and tribal governments to make our streets safer. We need to look at ways to not only operationalize that program, but create a structure where we can produce, the right kinds of successes and opportunities that can be scaled, even for folks that may not necessarily take advantage of that program as well. Beth also mentioned the complete streets recommendations and reports, the National Roadway Safety Strategy. We have a once in a generation, if not a once in a lifetime, to make a difference. And we're working assiduously to do just that.
Thank you. We really appreciate that, Beth. We appreciate all of your advocacy, and we look forward to being in touch with both of you to get some guidance on our advocacy from Beth, and to work with you, Andrew, to do what we can to support your efforts. Thanks very much.